Good evening. My name is Hana Sharif, and I'm the Augustin Family Artistic Director of the Repertory Theatre of St. Louis. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our series launch of Represent STL with our groundbreaking discussion, Breaking Down the Ballot. Represent STL is a curated conversation series where we bring together a cross-section of our community, artists, activists, community members, and thought leaders to have meaningful discussions that build bridges of understanding, empathy, and progress for our community. As a recent transplant to the region, I was struck by the complexities of how our state, county, and city governments intersect. And as we connected with patrons and community members, we repeatedly heard questions about the new voting laws and ballot initiatives. In an effort to help cultivate an informed electorate, we are honored to be joined by this esteemed panel of experts. Joining us today are Michaela Allen, Eric Fay, Dr. Gina Gunn McClendon, John Hancock, Denise Lieberman, and Alejandro Santiago.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Wonderful. I'm gonna call you as I see you in our Brady Bunch screen, but I'm wondering if each of you will share your title and briefly tell our audience a bit about what you do. And we'll start with, at the top square for me, Eric Fay.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. My name's Eric Fay. I'm the Democratic Director of Elections for the St. Louis County Board of Elections. In Missouri, we have 116 different local election authorities. In St. Louis County, we have a bipartisan Board of Elections. I am a lifelong St. Louisan. Grew up here, went to Webster University and UMSL, University of Missouri St. Louis. I've been working in elections for about 13 years in one capacity or another. I've been director for a little over 5 years. And that's pretty much me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to the conversation. Michaela Allen.
Thanks so much. Michaela Allen, my pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I'm the electoral justice organizer with Action St. Louis. So I pretty much work on all things pertaining to both statewide and local elections. We focus on building campaigns that will strengthen Black political power in the St. Louis region.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Denise Lieberman.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for having me. My name's Denise Lieberman. I am a civil rights lawyer who specializes in voting rights and election law, and have been doing voting rights and election law for about 25 years. Both on the national level, I spent the last 13 years in Washington, D.C., most recently as the director of the voting rights program nationally for Advancement Project National Office, which is a racial justice organization. I'm currently back in Missouri full-time, and I am the general counsel to the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, which is a nonpartisan statewide network of voter advocates across the state of Missouri. And we work to protect the right to vote through several buckets of work. We engage in policy advocacy, tracking legislation in the Missouri General Assembly and in Congress. Through legal advocacy and litigation, we are currently counsel of record on 2 cases that we're seeking to clarify Missouri's new election laws to ensure all voters could safely cast ballots in the pandemic. Through voter education and outreach, so we produce palm cards, toolkits, trainings, and our signature service program is coordinating the Missouri election protection efforts, which are the nonpartisan election monitoring and legal hotline efforts in Missouri.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
John Hancock.
Hi, I'm John Hancock. I went to UMSL and then went to Mizzou and was in the journalism school until they asked me not to come back. And then I graduated from UMSL, got a master's degree from Rutgers, served a couple terms as a Republican in the Missouri General Assembly. I'm a Republican political consultant and half of the bipartisan team of Hancock and Kelly on KMOX Radio and KTVI Fox 2.
Thank you so much for being here. Alejandro.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. And my name is Alejandro Santiago. I am the membership manager at the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. And at the Chamber, we work for the advancement of the Hispanic community and the community of business at large. through many resources and tools like networking and marketing and counseling in order to make this and better.
Thank you so much for being here. And our final panelist, Dr. Gina Gunn McClendon.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate. So I'm Gina Gunn McClendon, and I work in the Brown School, which includes social work, social policy, and public health at Washington University. And I direct the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative that was started in 2017. We basically have 4 pillars of work that are centered around democracy and voting. And those pillars are research, inclusion, support of other organizations in this fight for democracy, and then engagement. How do we engage new people, and particularly those students at the university, in becoming sort of like our voter protectors, the next generation, I should say.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for being here. We could not ask for a more esteemed panel of experts, and I think we should dive in. I know there are a lot of questions and a lot of ground to cover in the time that we have. I want to start with some of the big general questions, and Denise, I'm wondering, especially as someone working in a nonpartisan voter protection advocacy role, looking at some of the new laws, for folks who are completing a mail-in or absentee ballot, can you explain the notary process for us? And what happens, I suppose, if a voter cannot get to a notary due to disability?
Those are great questions, and thank you for asking them. You know, in Missouri, Missouri is one of just a very small number of states, actually. Only 3 states require voters to have some ballots notarized. And here in Missouri, unless you are casting an absentee ballot through the mail for reasons that are related to health, either because you're confined due to illness or serving as a caretaker for someone who is, or if you are in an at-risk category for COVID-19, including any person over 65, those folks do not need to get an absentee ballot that is being sent by mail notarized. But voters who are getting ballots through the mail for any other reason, like being outside the jurisdiction, or because they're working as a poll worker, or for some other reason, or any voter casting a no excuse mail-in ballot. This is something that's new for 2020. All of those voters will need to have those ballots notarized. There are a number of sources of information to access free notaries, including the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition's Notary Hub, which is at notaryhub.movpc.org. But we know that there are a lot of people that will experience barriers or difficulties to accessing notaries because of the pandemic. Many notaries are not working on a full schedule. Some may not have availability evenings and weekends. If you live in a more remote part of the state, it may be a ways before you can find somebody who is able to notarize your ballot, and they can't be done remotely. But you do have other options. Again, if you qualify to vote absentee for a health-related reason, you don't need to get the ballot notarized. In addition, if you qualify to vote absentee, you may want to consider casting an absentee ballot in person at your local election authority office or one of their satellite locations, where you won't need to have the ballot notarized because you're casting the ballot there in person. You're presenting ID to an election official, just as you would if you were going to a polling place on election day. And so you won't have to get your ballot notarized for that reason. But there are a number of organizations that have really stepped up to the plate to try and ensure that voters who need access to notaries can get them. And so I encourage people to check out our Notary Hub, as well as the Secretary of State's list of notaries that are willing to notarize ballots for free, and the many other local community groups and organizations that are notarizing ballots. And by the way, your local election office, as I'm sure Eric will share with you as well, can also notarize ballots.
It's great. Can I ask a follow-up question? If you do fall into a category because of health conditions or being a caretaker of someone with significant health conditions, do you have to offer some type of documentation of that?
No, you don't. Really, what the law is the voters' expectation of what will keep them from going to the polls on election day. And it's kind of important to note here that Missouri is kind of an outlier in this regard. The vast majority of states don't require voters to provide any reason to cast an absentee ballot, 34 states plus the District of Columbia. And that's really something we need to be looking at here in Missouri as well. But currently you do have to list one of those reasons. But it's based on your subjective expectation, and it does have to be a good faith belief. Lying on the form is a criminal offense. It's very serious, but it is based on your good faith belief of what will keep you from going to the polls on election day. If you expect that you will be confined due to illness or disability or serving as a caretaker, or if you expect that you are in one of those 8 at-risk categories for COVID-19, you can cast an absentee ballot without a notary. In addition, if you expect that you'll be outside the jurisdiction, even if it doesn't come to fruition, if you reasonably expect that to be the case, that's the basis on which you would indicate your reason. You don't have to provide additional medical documentation or answer medical questions.
Great, thank you. And in this state, when do your mail-in ballots have to be postmarked? Is it postmarked or received here?
So, and again, this is another one of these rules that varies from state to state. Some states have a postmark deadline, but here in Missouri, we actually have a receipt deadline.
Oh, okay.
So if you got a ballot by mail and you're returning it to your local election authority, you can't turn them in at your polling place. You can't return a completed ballot at your polling place. It has to go to your local election office. Those have to be received by your local election office by the close of polls on election day, no matter what time you put them in the mail. Now, with absentee ballots, you do have the option of returning them in person yourself or by a close relative. But for the no excuse mail-in ballots, though we did challenge this in court and initially got a ruling allowing them to be returned in person, but that's no longer in effect. It's been stayed. So those mail-in ballots can only be returned by United States mail. And I'm sure my other panelists, including Mr. Fay, would have a lot of information to share on this as well.
I'd love to open it up. How do we find out where our local what the local resources are? How do we know where to go and deliver our ballots or where to mail our ballots into?
Well, you're going to want to go to your local election authority. There is a list on the Secretary of State's website at sos.mo.gov/elections. And there's a list of all the local election authorities. You plug in your address and it'll point you to that office. But each local election jurisdiction, and there's 116 of them in Missouri, have their own websites. They each have their own phone numbers to call. And you can always call your local election authority as well. The staffs are very busy and they're working hard, but they are generally extremely helpful and willing to talk to voters who call them.
Yeah, and in St. Louis County, for those of you that live in St. Louis County, where Eric is the director of elections, they have satellite locations so that you can go and vote prior to election day. Those are now open as of October 22nd. And I talked to somebody today, the wait was only 35 minutes. My wife voted the first day and she was in line for a little over an hour. But, you know, it's a process that you can go, you get in, your vote's counted. You don't have to have a notary. I have chosen that route in past elections. I'm voting by mail this year, have voted by mail this year. And, but those satellite locations are relatively new and they're very convenient and they're located, you know, very equitably throughout St. Louis County.
That's great.
Yeah, I feel also it's important to know that if you're mailing your ballot, you have to take in consideration the time delivery that USPS will take. So right now we are 8 days away from November 3rd, and you have the elector offices have to receive that ballot by November 3rd by 7 p.m. So just take in consideration how much time USPS will take to receive that ballot by that deadline. And if you think you don't have enough time, just make a plan to go on election day and just take all the measures to stay safe.
Is there a latest?
The city has satellite locations this time. So they're at the Central Library, Julia Davis Library, Shafley, and Booter. Yeah. So first time ever. It's really great.
And where would we find, is that also, we can track through the Secretary of State's website to find out where those satellite locations are in our region, in our counties and cities?
Mm-hmm.
How do you find that information outside of this wonderful panel?
Your local election authority website will be a wonderful source of information. They may look a little different depending on which county you live in, but they're largely going to all have that information. And you can also always call your local election authority. I found that they're very, very helpful when voters call. The final thing I want to throw in there, though, and Alejandra made a great point, because we are only 8 days out, and you might be feeling a little bit nervous if you just got your ballot and maybe you haven't filled it out yet, maybe you haven't found a notary yet, maybe you might be getting nervous that it might be getting a little close to the wire to send it back through the mail. Voters who've requested but not returned, not have processed a ballot through the mail, an absentee or mail-in ballot, can surrender those ballots at the polling place on election day if you did not get a chance to turn them in. Everybody only gets one vote, but if you requested that ballot through the mail but you did not get a chance to turn it back in, you can take it with you to the polls. You know, I'm holding an election protection sign. This is not it. We'll just pretend. You can surrender it. It's like spoiling your ballot. So you're not going to be able to turn the ballot in there, which is a little confusing. But you can, in essence, sort of trash it. You surrender it, spoil it. You can then cancel out that kind of absentee mail ballot request and vote at the polling place. If you requested but never received that ballot in the mail, and sometimes mail delays really cause things to get close to the wire, you can complete what's called a lost ballot affidavit. So they're going to have a list of everyone who requested those ballots, but you can say, I never got it. And you may have to sign a statement. You would have to tell the truth. You'd sign it under penalty of perjury, saying, I never got that ballot.
Yeah, St. Louis County's got a great feature. I don't know about other jurisdictions, but in St. Louis County, when you receive your ballot, there's a tear-off, and it's got a unique identifier, and you can actually go online and ensure that your ballot was received by the election authority. And so that's kind of a little bit of comfort for people. You vote by mail, and you can then track your own ballot, make sure that, and if it's there, then it gets counted. So that's kudos to Eric and his team. That's a really good feature.
That's great. So is there anything else we need to know about mail-in ballots that we haven't covered thus far?
The one thing I just like to add real quick, when it gets really close down to the wire, especially for people who are out of town, college students or anybody else who's away out of town, where turning in the ballot in person is not an option for them. It is not cheap, but express mail is always an option for people. And we always mention that to people when we hear from them a day or two before the election and they're in, New York or California, we say, well, you can overnight that thing to us and it will still count. But like everybody else, that it does still have to be here by 7 p.m. on election night.
7 p.m. 7 p.m. everyone. That's the witching hour. I've just written it down for myself. Moving into November 3rd. If you're voting in person on November 3rd, what, if any, accessibility options do residents have? We see on the news long lines even for the early voting. We imagine November 3rd will be an intense day of Americans coming out to exercise this sacred right. What accessibility options do we have here in Missouri?
So I think every voting place must have accessible voting system for individuals with disabilities, including audiovisual accessibility. Also these systems include audio ballot to make your selections, or the ability to just enlarge the text if you have issues with just like seeing a small font, so that you can read it on the screen. So ideally, every voting place already has measures for accessibility already there.
Yeah, and again, I'm going to tout St. Louis County. You are assigned a particular polling place to go to on election day, but this year, in the age of COVID, You can vote at any polling place in St. Louis County. If you're a resident registered to vote in St. Louis County and your local polling place has got a line out the door, you can go to any other polling location and cast your ballot. That's a really nice access point for people this time.
I also want to add that voters have a right to assistance if they need help, either reading or casting their ballot. And that can be, you might need help reading your ballot because you're visually impaired, or maybe it's because you have dyslexia, or maybe you have limited English proficiency or low literacy. Voters have a right if they need assistance reading or casting their ballot. They might need help casting their ballot if they have a physical impairment or something that prevents them from being able to mark the ballot correctly. And this right exists even if you're voting at home. So I'll just use an example from my own family. My mother is 89 and homebound. I serve as her caretaker. And she gets a ballot. She's on the permanent absentee list and gets a ballot through the mail. Well, she has a hand tremor. She's smart. She's sharp as a tack. I'll tell you what. Those of you who know her know that's the truth. So she knows exactly who she wants to vote for, but she can't fill in those circles. And so she tells me who she wants to vote for, and I can fill those in for her. On the absentee ballot envelope, there's a place to mark that if the voter has received assistance. So I sign that envelope too, and indicate that I've provided assistance because she has a hand tremor. At the polling place, the voter's entitled to be assisted by any person they choose, except for their boss or their union representative, but anybody else. And the person who's assisting them doesn't need to be a registered voter, even 18. In fact, we know in our some of our immigrant communities, parents will bring their children in to help translate for them some of the more complex ballot measure pieces.
Oh, and you know, speaking of being able to do that, I was able to take my husband's, we voted absentee, and I was able to go down to the election authority, take mine and his, and turn it in because we're related, married.
We had a question come up in the chat. If you are voting absentee in person, do you need to have that notarized? And if so, is there a fee for on-site notaries?
No and no.
Nope.
Excellent.
And that's because you're voting in person at the election authority office. You're showing your ID to an elections official, much in a very similar way if you were going to a polling place on election day. And so you don't need to have your ballot notarized if you're voting in person.
There were a couple of questions about whether or not there's curbside voting in this state.
There is.
And how does that work?
Well, any voter who is within 200 feet of a polling place who has physical barriers to entering the polling place can request curbside voting. In which case a bipartisan team of election workers would come out and check you in and give you a ballot that you can cast from your car.
I'd just like to add to that really quick. In advance of Election Day, at least in St. Louis County, at the Election Board headquarters in St. Anne, you can come vote curbside if you need that service. And we have it set up in a relatively efficient way. It's about as efficient as curbside voting can be. I want to emphasize to voters that curbside voting under state law, like Denise mentioned, is available at every polling place on Election Day. It's not terribly efficient. So somebody has to go in and tell the election judges that they're outside or that somebody is outside that needs that service. And it will be provided to anybody who requires it on Election Day. But as John mentioned, you can go to any polling place in St. Louis County. So if you desire or need curbside voting, I would really encourage folks to come to our main office in St. Anne because it will happen there more quickly and more efficiently than it will at probably any polling place.
We had another question in the chat asking if you needed to sign up in advance to early vote, or could you make the decision to go in early to vote at any time before November 3rd?
Yeah, if you go to the election authority or one of the satellites, you just go.
Excellent.
Right, but it's not early voting; it's absentee.
Correct.
It's absentee.
Right.
Can you talk about the difference between early voting and absentee? Or
Well,
is there such thing as early voting here in Missouri?
no.
Missouri doesn't offer so-called early voting. In other words, in order to vote before the election day, in order to vote at a polling place before election day, you have to have a reason. You have to give I'm going to be out of town. I got, there's a list of reasons to check. Now the mail-in voting is different. You can vote mail-in for any or no reason at all. That's a new law in 2020. But to vote before the election day, it is an absentee process. And you go to the satellite office and they'll fill out why you're voting absentee and cast it down.
But for someone who may not know the difference, if you show up at your election authority, your local election authority, and say, I want to vote early, someone will walk you through the absentee voting process.
Yes.
And
You do need a reason. You need to list one of the 7 reasons, though. And again, like we said earlier, and I know Michaela will probably want to speak to this too, Missouri really is an anomaly in that the vast majority of states don't require people to have a reason to vote before Election Day. Missouri does, though Missouri has expanded some of those options because of COVID this year. Those options will expire at the end of the year. And I think, that's something we should think about moving forward, is how we can make this process more accessible to voters throughout Missouri going forward.
Mm-hmm. And I'd also like to mention, we keep forgetting about the city. So with the city on November 3rd, you have to go to your designated polling place. We don't have the luxury of the county. The county made a great investment in getting print-on-demand ballots.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they're able to go any place. But St. Louis City still has the same thing with precincts. And so one of the things I want to remind people is that if you go to a polling place, let's say, for example, you've moved, but you're still registered to vote. If you go to the polling place, your new place, sometimes the poll workers will tell you, oh, you can't vote here. You have to go to this place. No, that's not true. You go to the polling place where your address is, what your identification is, and you ask for an affidavit to update your address.
So let's say that I'm in the city and I end up at the wrong precinct. They will reroute me to the appropriate precinct based on my address?
Ideally, that's what should happen.
Right.
And that's a really important point to make, because aside from St. Louis County that can print precinct-specific ballots, in Missouri, if you are not at your correct polling place, your vote won't count.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. Denise, maybe we ought to mention the provisional ballot voter. Eric, can you explain that?
Well, one of the biggest, most common issues that we get at the Election Protection Hotline, which I will share here, 866 our vote, on Election Day, is from people that show up at the polls and they say, they tell me I'm not on the rolls, and there may be any number of reasons for that. It could be something as simple as a typo or a mistake, or maybe you moved and didn't update your address. And it should spark a review of your registration. And sometimes the poll worker will have to call the election authority to check your registration status. If they cannot find you on the voter rolls, if there's some glitch and they can't find you on the voter rolls, but you're convinced that you're registered there, you have a right to cast a provisional ballot. They're going to give you a little tear off piece of paper that has an 800 number on it that you can call to see if that ballot was counted. And it'll be counted after the fact if it turns out that you were in fact registered and there was just some glitch.
Thank you. So you will be able to track, if for some reason you're given a provisional ballot, you'll be able to track whether or not your ballot is counted by calling in with the official number of your provisional ballot.
That's right.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for the overarching questions. I'd love to dive into some of the statewide questions that we're seeing come up. I want to dive right into one of the big ones. There's a constitutional amendment that looks at the redistricting process and banning gifts from lobbyists and to legislators. This seems like a multifaceted amendment. For someone who's new to Missouri, what is redistricting and what does that mean? And how does that affect communities? I know it's a big question.
So I can jump in. Redistricting essentially refers to the drawing of electoral boundaries. It's the way that we draw our maps. And so what really Amendment 3 is it's this trick wrapped up in a bow. We, in 2018, as voters, actually passed an initiative called Clean Missouri, or then it was Amendment 1, that completely overhauled the way that we draw our districts. Completely changed some of those rules that allows for maps to be gerrymandered. And that means that those maps will be skewed in favor of one political party or the other. And so Amendment 3 is essentially a amendment about redistricting wrapped up and disguised as a $5 lobbyist gift limit change and a $100 state Senate contribution change. What Amendment 3 is really about is redistricting. The explicit goal of Amendment 3, the really big part of it, is they want to change who counts in Missouri. Politicians want to cut immigrants and children out of our population for the purpose of drawing these legislative maps. So that means that when we count communities, when we determine political representation, resources coming to communities, communities which are particularly Black and communities of color that have more children and more immigrants in their population will be affected, effectively slicing up those communities and making it so that our voices.
Well, let me see if I could weigh in on this just a little bit.
Yes, please, John.
So Missouri's former redistricting law would require the Democratic Party to submit 10 names to the governor and the Republican Party to submit 10 names to the governor. So the parties got to pick the people they wanted on these redistricting panels. And these are the panels that would draw state House and state Senate lines. Those lines have to comport with the U.S. Constitution. They have to be contiguous, they have to be compact, and they have to be roughly equal in population. Those are U.S. constitutional standards for any redistricting that takes place. The governor then would pick 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans to meet as a commission for the purpose of drawing legislative district lines. 7 of them would have to agree. So it would have to, by definition, be a bipartisan agreement on a map. If 7 could not agree, then the maps would go to the courts, and the Missouri courts would draw the final boundaries. And that happens about half the time. Half the time, the commissions actually are able to get together and reach an agreement. What Clean Missouri did 2 years ago was it eliminated that whole process. And look, people that supported Clean Missouri believe that the old process was inherently political, inherently biased. That's a judgment call that I'm not going to answer for voters. Mm-hmm. But I will say that the old system was truly bipartisan. What we've replaced it with is we placed a state demographer appointed by the state auditor, and that state demographer, one person, is now responsible for drawing the legislative district lines. Republicans believe that was done because the state auditor was the only Democratic office in Missouri, and that's why that office was given the authority to appoint the state demographer. Democrats believe that Republicans have taken advantage of the redistricting process, particularly by coming in coalition with African Americans to draw districts that African Americans supported in Democratic areas, majority minority districts, to the detriment of a fairer representation for the two parties. And so Democrats believe that the old system had become politicized and unfair, and they've replaced it with this appointment of a state auditor. So the two parties disagree on that. The voter's going to have to kind of look at it and make up their own mind. You're correct that all of the ethics stuff is a red herring. It was in 2018 when Clean Missouri passed, and it certainly is here with Amendment 3.
Okay, great. So just to clarify, because it's one of the things when I looked at this amendment, I went, oh, these feel like two very different questions combined into one amendment.
Yeah.
So banning gifts paid from lobbyists to legislators, which, you know, I understand, and reducing legislative campaign contribution limits is essentially its own question, but for the purposes of our ballot, it was folded into the same amendment. So if we say yes to this question, we're essentially voting on both of these issues. There's no separation of these two issues.
A yes vote takes you back to the old way of doing redistricting with commissions appointed by the governor. A no vote takes you to what the voters passed in 2018, which was the appointment of a state demographer to draw the district lines. I think that's roughly a fair assessment of what's at stake. All the ethics stuff, the ethics reforms in this Amendment 3 are minuscule based on what was already passed in 2018. So, I wouldn't encourage anyone to make up their minds on the basis. I do think it's unfortunate that it was written that way, but it was written that way. So that's what we've got to deal with. But the heart of the issue is over how we're going to draw legislative district boundaries.
So recognizing that the heart of this amendment is that, I wanted to open up to the rest of the panelists to speak about the concept of redistricting and what this amendment means in the way that John identified. Is there other information, contextualizing information you would give us to understand this?
Well, with all due respect, I think I might take issue with John's characterization that voting yes on this would simply return us to the way things were before, because this actually does make some fairly dramatic changes into how we draw district lines. And it's not just returning to the status quo. It changes who gets counted for purposes of redistricting, not counting all members of the population, leaving out non-citizens, leaving out people under 18, which we've always counted. So that's a major change. So that's not taking us back to the way things were before. That's a major, major change. And we know that that will disproportionately impact communities of color, African-American, Latinx, and Asian American communities that have more members of the communities who are under 18. And their voices deserve to be represented in the redistricting process as well. Another piece that is decidedly different is it also makes it harder to challenge discriminatory maps in court. And maybe I just get tunnel focus as a lawyer on what the legal stuff is, but we do have laws in place that allow people to challenge discriminatory maps. And that's part of the way that we can hold people accountable to ensure that there's some fairness in the districting process. And so this does fundamentally change the legal standards and the ability, the standing that people would have to challenge maps that they perceived as discriminatory in court. So I think those are really significant changes that did not exist even before Clean Missouri was passed in 2018 that would add some additional pieces in Missouri.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to speak to this?
Yeah, and I think it's important to add too, just really harping on the impact of this policy, because Denise, I think you're right. This is something that Missouri has never seen before. This is actually something that no state in the United States has seen before. Changing the way that we count people. And so, as I was saying, what Amendment 3 does is slice up communities. But the explicit goal of this policy is to entrench Black and brown voters in white voters, and to take away the political power that we do have, because when politicians don't feel accountable to us as voters, when they know that they don't need us to win their district or to win the area that they're in, they're less likely to build an agenda that is specifically for us and for our communities. So I believe it's deeply important to look at, even the numbers, as has been mentioned, into how this policy would impact people. Almost 30% of Black Missourians are immigrants and children. Over 54% of Latinx and Asian American communities are immigrants and children. This directly impacts the amount of resources that we will receive, the political representation we will receive, as well as, like I said, most importantly, that voter accountability piece.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to speak to this amendment?
If I could just add one more thing, and then So I also just, Amendment 3 is really the last, like it's politicians' last grab at trying to rig the rules before their maps are drawn. The maps are drawn based off of like following the 2020 census. So this amendment will determine what the maps look like, and in turn, what our communities will look like for the next decade. The maps are drawn every 10 years. So this amendment is deeply important. And then, again, just, talking about Clean Missouri, some of the redistricting reforms that were put in place. Clean Missouri passed with 62% in every single state Senate district. So this is absolutely what the voters wanted. Amendment 3 is a direct attack on undermining the will of the voters and what we've already passed forward. And in addition, we actually haven't gotten to see the effects of Clean Missouri yet. Because as I said, the maps are drawn every 10 years following the 2020-2010 census. So the maps are set to be redrawn in 2021.
I appreciate the contextualization and also both perspectives on this very important amendment. One of the things that I think I've heard very clearly from both parties on this panel is the idea that truly this amendment comes down to the question of redistricting. So when you're looking at the amendment, not to be distracted by the other question of the banning small gifts paid from lobbyists to legislators, and really focus on where you sit in terms of the question of redistricting. There's another state amendment on the table that's looking at extending terms for elected state officials. I was wondering is there more information? What would that extension be? Are we talking about 1 term, 2 terms? And Denise and Eric, if either one of you want to take lead, or anyone on the panel want to jump in and talk about what that extension looks like and what it means?
Well, it's actually an extension of term limits to statewide elected officials that don't currently have any term limit. So currently in Missouri, only the governor and the state treasurer have a term limit. The other statewide elected officials do not, and this constitutional amendment would put in a 2-term limit for those other statewide elected officials.
So everyone would be limited to 2 terms in office as a state elected official.
Yeah, all the statewide elected officials would, and it would mirror, but the members of the General Assembly also have term limits. So in the state Senate, it's 2-term limit. It's a 2-term limit, and in the House of Representatives, it's a 4-term limit.
Is it
8 years in both cases? Yeah, this really comes down for the voter. This comes down to where you come principally on the issue of term limits. If you're a supporter of restricting the number of terms that elected officials can hold office, then you're going to want to vote for this. If you believe principally that term limits have had a deleterious effect on the functioning of government, then you're going to want to vote no on this. So it really is going to be up to the voters' assessment of how they perceive the idea of term limits.
And this is, again, as a newcomer to the state. So my follow-up question is really, is there any sense of like what percentage of our state elected officials this would affect? What percentage of officials are in office for a decade?
It's going to affect 4 people. It's going to affect the lieutenant governor, the secretary of state, the attorney general, and the auditor. And that's it.
Does anyone else want to speak to this one?
I think just one other interesting thing worth noting, both of these statewide constitutional amendments were put on the ballot by the state legislature. So it is often the case in Missouri that initiative petitions make things come onto the ballot, but these were both the action of the state legislature that put these on the ballot.
Can you speak more to this question of how things make it to the ballot? You said, so this came from the legislator, but the other process of having amendments make it to the statewide ballot, what does that look like?
It looks expensive and time consuming. For people collecting the signatures and the people like me who verify the signatures. So there is also this method in Missouri, the initiative petition process, where citizens can collect petition signatures from a certain percentage of registered voters in the various congressional districts across the state and put statutory amendments or constitutional amendments on the statewide ballot. And I don't know, Denise or John, either of you would probably know better than me. This is the first time in a long time that we have had no initiative petitions on the ballot in a general election in Missouri.
Yeah, Missouri is a state that is very friendly towards the initiative petition process. I mean, it is a fairly common practice for advocates to go out and collect signatures and put things on the ballot. This is just just to have these two. So you have the referendum process, which flows through the legislature, and then you have the initiative process, which flows through the people. And both of those channels can place things on the ballot before the voters. They could be constitutional amendments or statutes, laws. Either one. The signature requirements are a little different depending on what you're doing. But yeah, you're right, Eric. It is fairly rare that we don't have the citizen initiatives on this particular ballot.
I would add that I think ballot initiatives, I think our initiative petition process is also pretty great, and that ballot initiatives are tools that voters can use to make changes in their community. They have the potential to, truly shape our lives, as they are a powerful tool of our democracy, and communities can choose what they would like to see. For example, Medicaid expansion was on the ballot in August, and I, had the pleasure of seeing almost all of that happen, from the signature gathering phase to verification, where we collected almost 200,000 signatures statewide, and got to see it on the ballot. And so it's also this lesson in co-governance for voters and for us as communities, where we can really decide what we want to see for our communities, get enough people to put it on the ballot, and then see it all the way through, which is what happened in August with Medicaid expansion when we passed it, and 200,000 more Missourians gained access to health care. Same thing with minimum wage in 2018. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question in terms of the initiative? Is this correct? Initiative petition? That's how you can get something on the statewide ballot. Is that true for county and city ballots as well? Initiatives on ballots?
Good question. In most cases, no. So for counties and cities that are so-called statutory counties or cities, there really is no initiative petition process. But for counties and cities that have charters, meaning their home rule counties or cities, quite often there is an initiative petition process. So St. Louis County is a charter county. It has an initiative process. So does St. Louis City. It's a charter city. And we have a number of charter cities throughout St. Louis County. But for the vast majority of counties and cities in the state of Missouri, there's no initiative petition process at the local level.
Interesting. Thank you. Does anyone else want to speak to anything around how measures make it to the ballots? Wonderful. I'd love to move into some of the questions in the county. I will tell you, there's so many municipalities in the county, and I am fascinated by how the districts work as a collective. And I was wondering if Eric and Gina, maybe you guys could speak a little bit to how it works with so many municipalities. How do these districts work as a collective? How are countywide decisions made? Especially when there are competing interests amongst the different municipalities. How does that work? or does it work?
Yeah,
Maybe that's the first question.
You probably need a semester-long class on that. But just speaking about the election, you mentioned there are a number of municipalities and fire districts and school districts that might have things on the ballot. And that is relatively common. So I don't even know really where to go with that question, because it's so wide open. So St. Louis County is relatively unique in that we do have this plethora of political subdivisions, and under Missouri law, cities and other special districts, are allowed to elect their respective boards, and if they want to have a tax increase or go into debt to pay for some kind of a capital construction project or something, they need to go to the voters for that. So We see things on the ballot quite often in St. Louis County at the hyper local level, electing those local boards and voting on local tax issues and other things like that. But I'll let Gina maybe speak more to that because again, that's
Yeah,
more
that
academic question than anything.
yeah, that's a pretty loaded question, and I really don't have much more to add to that, other than all of this. The best way to contextualize some of this, the different kinds of things that go on, has a lot to do with racism, and I'll stop there.
In the county specifically or across the state?
Well, I can speak to the county specifically. You know, St. Louis City and County were one county at one time. So 10 years ago, and through and it changed. I don't know what, in the late 1800s or early 1900s, something like that. And a lot of it had to do with segregation of race, the separation of the two. So, you know, St. Louis County, a lot of the municipalities still have things on their books, on the rules that say that white people can't sell to black people. Yeah, it's still there. Is it recognized? No, but it's still there. So a lot of this disconnectedness has a lot to do with zoning and all kinds of things, which is why we're where we are now.
This brings me to really the next part of this question, which is how do the county and city really intersect? How do those governments work together? It seems like there's a very deep, complicated history between the county and the city. So, you know, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. How are the county and city governments working together to help protect our region? Is there a process, a clear process for that? Not specifically with COVID, but for the county and city to work together?
It's a mess, Hana. It's a mess. And if you look at regions of the country that are becoming more equitable and becoming more economic growth friendly, there are places that have consolidated. They brought cities and counties in disrepute. Look at Louisville. Look at Nashville. And these are places that have gotten rid of their divisions largely and brought everybody together into one entity. They've reduced the cost of government. They've gotten rid of archaic laws that we were just speaking about, and they put some uniformity in place so that businesses can locate there and know what they're dealing with. They don't have to get a business license over here with another business license, pay a different sales tax in this location. I mean, there are literally food trucks, depending on where they park. If you buy the food on the front end of the truck, you pay a different sales tax than on the back end of it. I mean, it's so ridiculous, and I do think that someday, I hope and pray that we can, all of us, come together and figure out this broken system, costly, bloated, corrupt system of government that we have, because I do think that's something, I think all the people on this panel could agree to something like that, because what we're living in right now is a mess.
So I'm a Texan, and I will say that when that shift started to happen in the major metropolitan cities in Texas, it wasn't driven by a moral imperative, but rather by the economics, right? Sure. It just makes financial sense. But it does mean releasing and working together and integrating in a really meaningful way. So complicated question. Everyone agrees it's a bit of a mess. There's work to be done in our state or in our region with the county and city working together. The next question we have on the county front is that each county district is uniquely different. Some will have additional propositions and amendments than others. So for example, the residents of Maryland Heights will have a vote on the question of Proposition 5, which is a tax that the Fire Protection District wants voters to support. Eric, are you able to, or Alejandro, to talk about this proposition and what that tax is, how it'll be assessed, and why it's important to the residents of Maryland Heights?
So as you said, each county has its special needs, and sometimes those needs will be, reflected on the ballot. And a literal example of that is the proposition that you just mentioned. And so in this case, the district officials want to increase the property tax to no more than 39 cents per $100 assessed valuation. So meaning that the owner of a $200,000 home would pay about $148 more annually. And then the reason behind it that is that officials say that district costs have increased while revenue has decreased. So also volume calls has increased for the past 10 years. So it's just important to, it's important because it comes down to the voter, whether they consider the fire district needs the funding or not. And it's important because every decision that it's going to affect your community, you have to have a say on it. And this is an example of how important it is that when you go and vote, you're going to see tangible results when you go and vote.
I would just add a couple of things really quick. This really highlights the fragmentation that was mentioned earlier. The city of Maryland Heights and the Maryland Heights Fire Protection District are two completely different things. They overlap by large extent, but there are probably parts of the Maryland Heights Fire District that is not in the city of Maryland. Well, I know for a fact that are not. And there are parts of the city of Maryland Heights that aren't in the Maryland Heights Fire Protection District. So I do some international election observation from time to time, once or twice a year. And when I talk to election officials in other countries, they're always flabbergasted by the hyper-localization of elections in the United States. It does make things confusing for voters sometimes, but I always tell people, I think in the United States, and especially in Missouri, we vote a lot on a lot of things in Missouri. What we perhaps give up in efficiency in some regards, I think in some regards we gain back in responsiveness. So we do have a say on a lot of things. And in the state of Missouri, our state constitution requires that anytime a local government wants to raise taxes, it has to go to a vote of the people, which is not the case in a lot of states. So for better or for worse, that is the case. And I think that the point that was just made, even these very local issues have to go to a vote of the people, and it's very important that people educate themselves on it because it ultimately is up to them. It's not up to the people they elect.
That's right. I just want to take a moment. We're going to lose Denise Lieberman because she's very important work to do protecting voters' rights. But could you share with us the hotline for anyone who might need it as we look towards this election?
Thank you for the opportunity to promote the election protection hotline. And I do apologize. I am sort of double booked tonight. We do have an election protection training because we are now less than 8 days out from Election Day. And so we continue to recruit volunteers. I just want to promote whoops, I'm backwards on the screen, the election protection hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE. That's 866-687-8683. Voters can call that. You can text that number, or you can even chat with a lawyer at 866ourvote.org if you really don't want to talk to a live human. But those calls are answered in real time by an attorney. We actually have a national call center in Missouri. So voters who call from Missouri, they're going to be talking to an attorney in Missouri who can answer your questions. We also have, a Spanish language hotline, 888-VOTA, who can speak to voters in Spanish. Arabic language hotline and Asian languages hotline as well. Voters should know they never need to leave a polling place without being able to talk to someone in real time and be able to cast a ballot, no matter what your question is. They can check your voter registration, confirm your polling place, tell you what kind of ID you need, and also help if you are experiencing any problems at the polls on Election Day. We're going to have 1,300 volunteers out monitoring polls on Election Day. We've got several hundred attorneys who are ready to go and help anybody who calls. And so this is a community project. You know, no one's alone in voting, and all of us have a role to play to make sure that everybody can cast a ballot. So voters can call 866-OUR-VOTE. 866-687-8683. And I do appreciate the opportunity to raise that. And I apologize to have to get out, but this election protection training was scheduled a while back.
Thank you so much. It's been really wonderful to have your insights on this panel. And I think one of the most important takeaways that you just delivered to us is that no voter should be walking away from the polls without having exhausted all the possibilities, and that 1-800-OUR-VOTE is there to help. So thank you so much for your work.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the rep for all the great work you're doing to promote voter education. And, you know, with education, people can exercise their rights. And that's why this is so important.
Have a great night.
Thanks, Dave.
Eric, I just want to go back to the point that you made about which I think is wonderful state. It's not true for every single state that or county that every measure has to be taken to the people in terms and to your point about the hyper locality of our work. I also wonder, though, specifically to this question, I had this aha moment as you were speaking about the fact that the fire protection district is larger than Maryland Heights. Does that mean that if you're in a county that's covered by this district, this question will show up on your ballot versus one of the other counties that's not part of this fire protection district? Or is it only folks in Maryland Heights, residents in Maryland Heights, that are going to see this question?
It's only people who live in the Maryland Heights Fire District that are going to see that question on their ballot. And the point I was trying to make is that there are some parts of the city of Maryland Heights that probably aren't in the fire district. So I want people not to be confused to the extent we can make them not confused. But yeah, there are districts that, local districts, fire protection districts, school districts that cover various parts of the county and overlap with a lot of other things. So that's why we have a particular challenge in St. Louis County in getting people the correct ballot. And that was a big reason why we chose last year to buy new voting equipment that was this print on demand system where the voter's ballot is printed on demand at the polling place, because we always had a challenge in St. Louis County of the poll workers giving the voter the wrong ballot. And now with this new system, in almost every case, we can be assured that the voter will receive the correct ballot and be able to vote on all the correct things, because we have this really confusing map in St. Louis County of all these overlapping districts.
If you were starting out to build a city and you wanted to devise the most dysfunctional government you could possibly come up with, you couldn't conceive of what we have built in St. Louis over the last 2 decades. And there are 43, I think. So some fire departments are municipal; they're run by the cities. Some fire departments are districts that are their own political jurisdiction. There are 55 police departments in St. Louis County. 55 police departments. Some of them very small. Not all of them equally trained. That's a problem. We've got a mess. I'm done.
So just to clarify, if I'm in the county, I show up with my identification, which we actually haven't talked about what you need to bring to be able to vote. Are the identification requirements the same in the county and the city?
They're the same across the state of Missouri.
Okay.
I can't say that they're implemented the exact same way across the whole state, but by and large they are. And it's just that voters are required in Missouri to bring some form of ID. It can be a picture ID or a non-picture ID. So things like driver's license, passports, all that works, but also the voter ID card from the election authority, utility bill, bank statement, things like that. And then in Missouri, if you bring no ID whatsoever, then you may vote a provisional ballot, and the election authority will count that provisional ballot after the election if the signature on the provisional ballot envelope matches the signature on the voter registration form on file with the election authority. So I highly encourage voters to bring some form of ID, but even if they don't, there is still a way for them to vote.
So if I'm in the county, I show up with my ID, you use my address to print me the proper ballot with the questions that affect my specific district, county, and I'm good to go.
Yes. Ideally, yes.
Great. Moving into city questions, and I'm a resident of St. Louis City, and there are a number of propositions on that ballot that I'm looking forward to us being able to dig into. One of the first questions, though, that I want to raise, because I've heard it a lot as I've talked to folks around the city, and I guess this is a question for both county residents and city residents. There's several judges up for re-election. If a judge is voted to be retained, how long is their term? And if a judge is not retained, who then takes their seat? Alejandra, Gina, either one of you want to take a stab at this?
Yeah. So regardless of whether they are elected or selected under a nonpartisan court plan, which is another thing by itself, a judge is going to serve only a specified term of years, which varies from 4 to 12 years, depending on the level of the court on which the judge sits. But also, in addition to that, the Missouri Constitution requires that all state judges retire at age 70. So there it is. Yeah.
And I guess the other thing too to note is that we have two different types of judges. We have partisan, we have nonpartisan, and so the partisan judges run under a particular party. So as Democrat or Republican, and then but the nonpartisan is appointed by the governor. And so if that person doesn't win, then the governor has an opportunity to appoint somebody based on a judicial commission recommendations. So it gets a little complicated, but that's pretty much how it works.
And also to the second part of the question of if a judge is not retained, then who takes their seat? So it starts with a process that's detailed on the nonpartisan selection of judges court plan. So if any person who meets certain constitutional requirements may apply for a judicial vacancy. And so from that pool of applicants, a commission consisting of citizens, attorneys, and a judge selects 3 candidates for the judicial vacancy. And the commission will forward these candidates' names to the governor, who then is going to select the judge from those 3 candidates. And after the judge has served on the bench for at least a year, then the judge goes for retention by the voters. That's what we're going to see in the ballot. So they have served at least a year. So you will see that on the ballot. And just a simple majority will suffice for the judge to be retained, which means if 51% of voters says yes, then he or she will go for another term.
Mm-hmm. And Alessandro keeps referring to the core plan, which is something that Missouri sort of brags about because we have that plan. It's very unique and distinct, and I don't think, are we one of the few states that have, I think we may be the only state that has a plan.
A lot of other states adopted it, actually.
Yeah, we had it first. And so there's a website, yourmissouri.judges.org. And if you go there, there's like a 10-minute YouTube video that talks about how we got to get the reasons why we had the core plan, the Missouri plan. And when you go there, you can click on, there's a link for judges, and it'll take you to a page with the different courts. Mm-hmm. So St. Louis City has a circuit court, and so does St. Louis County. So you click on whichever one is there, and that's where you can see all the judges that are running for office. What's there is a bio. There is something there that shows a survey of responses from jurors of that particular judge. There's also sort of a review or a vote of colleagues, their recommendations. And then this, I believe this is new. This is the first time I ever saw it, where they have opinions. So the judges, their written opinions are there, and I'm not sure who picks that. I would imagine they are the ones that pick which ones they want to go onto the website. But if you're pretty good at legalese, and you know, you can read through those opinions and get sort of a better idea of what kind of judge that person is. Outside of that, there isn't anything else at this particular time. Now, what has been suggested is that people, when judges are going to be, when they apply to become a judge, there's a process there, and that people, voters, can actually kind of trace that. They can go and they can pay attention, and then when that person gets into that particular office or that particular judgeship, then they should just follow that person. And then that way, when it's time to vote on, do a retention vote, they have an idea of what kind of judge that person is.
So I just want to follow up to, as a point of clarification, any judges that are on the ballot to be retained, are they all judges that have been appointed through this process by the governor and are now going to the people for the first time?
No,
to be
second or third, but yes, they're all judges appointed.
And you can't go by who appointed them. So let's say you lean more Democrat. You know, a Republican person may have appointed that judge who has the same viewpoints as you. So you can't necessarily go by that.
Very true.
So,
and currently there's no access to whatever information is part of their application process to have been appointed. But what we do have is via the website, that I would love for us to flash that website again for everyone. I think it's Our Judges.
YourMissouriJudges.org.
Thank you. YourMissouriJudges.org. Thank you for putting that up for everyone again. You can find bios. And do they have control over the responses from jurors, or it's a random selection?
I think it's a random survey that the jurors will take. When judges apply, they actually, I think there's on the website, on the cities and the county, you can just go to that website and there's a place where they actually apply for this position. So you can, I think voters or the public citizens can actually see that. They can sort of see the process and keep up with it. I haven't investigated a lot, but I was just told that recently.
Excellent.
But the main thing is that just, you know, you can't learn about a judge a few weeks before the election. You know, what was recommended to me was that you have a sense of who they are when they first come into that position.
Yeah, and I guess I would add, you know, if you've got a real stinker, and you know, I'm sure they exist, people tend to know about it. You know, lawyers will talk, activist communities will talk. So if you've got a judge that's a real stinker, it has a way of disseminating out to them.
And that's a judge that would likely not be retained, and then that position is open for appointment.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think to John's point, just one like interesting, I guess maybe trivia fact here. You know, my whole young adult life, people would always say, "Oh, those judges, I don't know anything about them. I'm not going to vote for them," or they always just get retained. Blah blah blah. Interestingly enough, I think like the last judge not to be retained was in the late 1940s, early 1950s. But the last two general elections in St. Louis County, we have had a judge not retained both times. And it had been like 50 or 60 years since that had happened. In 2016 and 2018, we had a judge each case that was not retained. And it was largely as a result, like John mentioned, the recommendation from the Bar Association that the lawyers were not getting along with these judges, and the voters listened to their recommendation and did not retain them. So it is, I don't think there's any negative recommendations this time around, but you know, we'll see what happens on election day.
I wanted to toss it over to Michaela. Does your organization have a platform around the judges?
We do. Action St. Louis Power Project has released 2 recommendations on the judges for the city that actually are vote no's. So Action STL Power on Instagram is going to lay out those endorsements, and Action STL on Instagram is our regular Instagram page where you'll find things about.
I wish I'd known about that. Now, I already voted. Okay.
Well,
Yeah, we don't normally do judges, but folks had
That's
questions about it, so we
excellent.
decided
Great.
to hop in when we could.
So we're flashing both of those on the screen. Alejandro, did you want to add to this, please?
Yes, just one little thing about, once we're in the topic of the trivia and just to brag about it, is that this plan that how judges get into be a judge started actually in the 1940s after voters back then thought that the process was very political. So they were not happy with it and they voted for this plan. And actually, it became a national model for how to elect judges or how judges sit on benches. And it has been adopted right now in more than 30 other states. So it is a nice thing to brag about that came out of Missouri.
I love it.
Mm-hmm.
Trailblazing. Missouri's trailblazing. Moving forward, I want to talk about some of the propositions on the city ballot. John and Gina, I'm tossing this to you first, but anyone feel free to hop in. We're looking at Proposition D, and I think we're going to be able to put the propositions up for folks viewing to take a look at it. It seems like a new election process for city government. If residents vote yes, what would the new election process entail? What are the key differences between what exists now and what will be if residents vote yes to Proposition D?
Go ahead, Gina.
Okay, so Proposition D is the shorter name, or the official name is approval voting. And so what approval voting does, it offers a way for more people to have a say-so on who wins an election. So for example, the last election that Mayor Kristen won, there were quite a few candidates that were in that race. And so the vote, like, how can I frame this? So after the primary, it left Mayor Kristen to be the candidate to run against the Republican person. Well, the problem with that is that Kristen only got like 30% of the vote. So for me, it's sort of like, okay, wait a minute. It's not 50%. She only got 32%. And I'm saying it's not her fault. That's just how the law is. But the idea is that it's more functional if there's an opportunity for people to be able to vote the way that the approval voting is laid out. Maybe somebody can explain it better than me.
If I can help here a little bit.
I can help in also. So essentially, Prop D is going to change the way that we elect public officials. And so what approval voting means is that voters will get a chance to vote for every candidate that they approve of on the ballot. Then the next step will be the top two candidates who receive the most votes. They will face off, and that will decide the winner. And so that's called a top two runoff. What a top two runoff gives us is, as voters, is the final choice on which candidate we prefer, and ensures that whoever wins actually receives at least 50% of the vote. Like was mentioned before, we have a mayor who technically only won 36% of the city, and one of her opponents had only lost by 888 votes, very close. And so with our current voting system, candidates can win city offices with less than 40% in the primary. And so this minor change will just make our voting system more fair. Most other cities have moved away from our current kind of antiquated system of voting, like Kansas City, Atlanta, Nashville, they all have this. So essentially, Prop D is about strengthening our democracy in this way, and actually empowering voters some as well, because some folks feel at the end of it like their candidate didn't even get elected. as you know, you would expect if you
Yeah,
only win
St.
30
Louis
to
City is a
40%
one-party
of
city, so a Republican has as much chance of getting elected in the city of St. Louis as roughly swimming across the Pacific Ocean with a clothespin on your nose. So, so that means that whoever wins that Democratic primary is the office holder. That's the practical application here. And to the lady's point, they are exactly correct. We are electing people in these multi-candidate Democratic primaries that are getting sometimes 30, 32% of the vote. They by default, and those primary elections are by nature lower turnout elections than general elections. So you're having a small subset of a smaller subset elect a small subset nominee who then automatically, in practice, goes on to win the seat. Now, one question I had, is this ranked order voting? In other words, do you have to list your, so you just,
No, it's two different things.
you vote for whoever you want, they all get one vote from you, and then whoever has the top two runs off in the
Right. And so
the system like this in St. Louis County. You know, I don't think the Democrats will let that happen in St. Louis County, but in theory, this does empower more people to have a say in who wins elections, and anything that is better for democratic participation is something that I think is definitely worth looking at.
Yeah. And then and to be fair, you know, what opponents say about this is that political parties would be hurt and that they would lose their candidates' party identity, and that ward committee system would be weakened. So just to be fair.
But it does mean that, you know, people are able to think independently about their candidates.
Yeah, you actually don't run under a party label in this system.
Interesting. It's an important major shift in the way, this proposition is a really important major shift in the way people are elected in the city. I really appreciate you guys breaking that down for myself personally, but also just to identify for those who are watching and listening that there are real life ramifications for the choices that you make on each of these propositions. Moving forward, does anyone else have anything else on Proposition D that you want to share to make sure that the electorate knows before we go to the polls, or as we go to the polls?
It's probably just important to note that it does, and I'm speaking as somebody from the county, but I do know this part of it at least. It does only apply to the municipal offices in St. Louis City. It doesn't apply to the so-called county offices. So like the city sheriff, circuit attorney, treasurer, recorder of deeds, those folks, it does not apply to those offices, just to your alderman, your mayor, comptroller, president of the board of aldermen.
Thank you for that very important clarification. Moving forward, there's another proposition, Proposition 1. This question is about local government employees living in the community in which they serve. Would love to hear, any of you can hop in. I'm going to toss it out there. Eric, Denise, Alejandro, John, any of you can answer to this question. Why is it important for this to be on the ballot, this concept of government employees living in the communities in which they serve?
Well, that depends on who you're talking to and your own experience. So I grew up in a small suburb right outside Chicago that experienced white flight. And so because of that, all of our businesses, we had Black businesses, we had Black police officers, fire department people. And so there was a sense in that community, there was this community kind of policing. And so and people were required to live in that community. And if you don't have to live in that community, you don't have any skin in the game. And so, in my opinion, if you want to create change, especially around policing, then I think it's important for people to live in the community where they are. I think the reason why it's on here, I think, is because the city claims that they can't find people to that want to be, for example, police officers. I don't know, Michaela, you probably know more about it than I do.
Yeah, so Proposition 1, with it permanently lifting the requirements for city employees, including police, which I think are the main focus of it. To us, what that translates to is more police from outside of our communities coming in to the city to police, surveil, patrol, and ultimately harass Black and communities of color. It's important to us to have Prop 1 on the ballot because I think we as voters and residents of the city deserve to have a say in what happens within it and how we will truly keep people safe. This issue is something that was also on the state level. So essentially us voting for this is somewhat symbolic because the state has already passed that we will lift the residency requirements in the city of St. Louis. Also, I think this proposition is important because we don't need more police. What we need are real public safety options that will make our communities better and safer to live in. That means, more affordable housing, more shelters for the unhoused, economic support, any number of those things that increasing our police force will not give us. There are thousands of people in St. Louis who are facing eviction, job insecurity, all of this, all while dealing with the pandemic. And I don't think the focus of that should be adding more police. And that to me is what's at the root of this proposition.
Can I ask a point? Yeah, go ahead, sir. No,
yeah,
please.
just to add a little bit more information to it is, as previously mentioned, the state legislatures passed HB 46 in September, which is the law that just was previously talked about, which requires St. Louis to lift those residency requirements for officers, firefighters, and other public safety workers for at least the next 3 years. So basically, Proposition 1 would officially amend that the city charters to exclude all city employees from the city from the residency requirement. So this Proposition 1 will be permanent instead of like a temporary type of amendment.
So the question is, should it be amended? If St. Louisans say no, it should not be amended, that means that it will not be permanently amended. But because the state legislation has already passed a law, we will see these requirements lifted for a 3-year period, regardless of what city residents vote here. Am I understanding that correctly?
Essentially, yes. My understanding, though, is that the state law applied just to, I think, public safety officers, and this charter amendment applies to all city employees. So I think that's one key difference.
And is there, we've heard a bit about it, is there a rationale for why it should be amended that anyone wants to put on the table for voters to think about?
Well, I mean, there is a principle that you ought to be able to live wherever the heck you want to in a free country. And, you can choose, I guess, not to go into city employment. But, I feel like our boundaries are a big part of what's screwed up this community. And so when you start, I don't think the future and the hope for real change is in boundaries. But that's just my opinion. It may be different.
So, I would just add one. Again, I factoid last time. I'll add another one. Regardless of what happens with this, the employees at the City Board of Elections will still have to be registered voters in St. Louis City because there's a whole separate state law that requires the employee of any Board of Elections in the state of Missouri to be a registered voter in that jurisdiction for a year prior to them being able to work for that Board of Elections. So I will say that the residency requirement in state law for election employees is difficult. In St. Louis City and St. Louis County, we're both overwhelmingly capital D Democratic jurisdictions now. So it's increasingly difficult sometimes to find Republican full-time employees, who fit the job description. So it can be restricting, and I'm just speaking about that from my own very, very narrow perspective here. But that's all I'll say about that.
And again, I just want to make sure I'm hearing the connotation clearly. That law will still be intact So there's a value that's been placed by state legislation on making sure that our state election officials live in the jurisdictions that they serve, but is lifting that or doesn't apply that same valuation on the officers and other employees of the city. There's a distinction being made between, and in some ways, value judgment. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the law about election employees is really old and is kind of an anachronism, but and nobody cares about election employees, so that is not argued in the state legislature. Yeah. But I was just speaking from my own experience here that you know, in some cases it can be a restricting thing when you're trying to find a specific type of employee with specific skill sets. You know, like in my case, you know, like an IT employee or something like that, or just anybody with election experience. I'd love to hire somebody from another state who has worked in the field of elections before, but I just can't. So it can be limiting.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Anyone else want to speak to Proposition 1, or have we well covered the basis on what we need to know as we go to the polls on this one? I appreciate it. We've got 2 more propositions, and then I know we've got some more questions coming in from the chat. Moving on to Proposition R. There's much movement around this topic. This is an effort to bridge a funding gap for early childhood learning, and that funding will be assessed as a tax. So how will this tax affect our daily lives? What does a yes to Prop R really mean? John, Gina, you guys want to take a first stab at this, and we'll open it up to the rest of the group?
Well, it's about a 30% increase in property tax for property owners. The funds, I think people feel strongly that they're needed. And one of the many problems that besets the city of St. Louis is the dwindling amount of property that is not nonprofit. The amount of nonprofit land in the city of St. Louis it would blow your mind. And so the private property that is taxable in the city is a dwindling resource. And that's where the problem is that in the city that they've raised the sales tax so high, which is a really regressive tax. They've raised the sales tax so high that that's no longer an option to go get money. And so the only real choices at this point are to tax property, or they can tax the nonprofit through what they call a pilot, a payment in lieu of taxes. Some cities have come to that point. St. Louis hasn't gotten there yet. But what this really is an example of is how tenuous the tax base is in the city of St. Louis, where you're talking about a 30% increase in property tax, or of the city's portion of the property tax. That's a lot.
Anyone else want to speak to this? Jamie?
Yeah, I mean, I can take a stab, and I'm a little bit newer to Prop R than I am Prop D or Amendment 3, but it's a 6-cent change in property taxes that will generate almost $2.5 million for our children in the form of early childhood services. An example of that is if this proposition passed, the owner of a home valued at $150,000 will pay about $17 more in taxes each year, starting in 2021. I think it's important to note that despite its importance, St. Louis and Missouri constantly overlook and underfund early childhood enrichment programs. Voting yes on Prop R means voting to invest in our children and their futures. Lack of quality education is the leading indicator of health disparities between Black and white residents specifically in St. Louis, where white children are 38% more likely than Black children to be enrolled in pre-K. That is what I can say about that.
Does anyone else
would love to be corrected if I'm wrong?
No, I think you're absolutely right about that. I think it's, what is it? If you have a house of like $150,000, you might pay an additional $17 a year more. And I think our children are worth that.
I do too.
Right. So Proposition R the way this tax affects our daily lives is that it affects the property tax for property owners in the city.
Yes.
And the tax directly funds early childhood services and community children's services, which it seems everyone's in agreement is necessary. The question is, how do we fund it? Where do we fund it? And who carries the burden of that? And that's the questions that the voters have to wrestle with independently in how they're going to vote on this issue. Is that an accurate summation?
Yeah.
All right. So Proposition T, another tax. Let's talk about the telecommunication tax. What is it? Why are residents being asked to pay a tax based on a service they might not need or use? John, Denise, Gina.
Well, I think the telecom companies are paying the tax, and this is 129 words, and it's one sentence. I mean, you talk about needing some assistance with the polls. Somebody. I mean, this thing is not exactly Hemingway. So right now, these telecom companies have to pay $2.20 per linear foot of fiber that they use, whether or not they have customers. So the proponents would argue that that's a disincentive for offering and expanding telecom access in the city of St. Louis. So in lieu of that $2.20 per linear foot, instead of that, they will pay a 7.5% of what is called a gross receipts tax based on the customers that they have. So the theory in supporting it is they're going to incentivize telecom to expand out access to more people in St. Louis by changing the way they are taxed. The opponents would say this is a special interest boondoggle for the telecom industry, and it's probably in the long run going to cost the city money. I think that's probably a reasonable assessment.
How does it benefit the voter? I see how it benefits the telecom company based on what you just described. How does it benefit the voter? It's increased access. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, bandwidth and access. I would assume. Believe me, I'm no expert. But I'm guessing it would expand like 5G access, faster speeds, and that sort of thing. I don't know that for a fact. But it's kind of an amorphous benefit. You know, is it a benefit to individual citizens? Is it a benefit to commerce? You know, those are the arguments that proponents would make to support this.
Other thoughts on this?
Yeah, just to be clear, gross receipts taxes are something that are on the ballot a lot in St. Louis County because we have all these municipalities. So a gross receipts tax is, as John said, it's something legally speaking that the company, the utility pays, but in reality, the customer of the utility, telecommunications company, gas company, electric company, water company, whatever, the customer pays that, and it's even itemized on your bill. So next time you look at your Ameren bill or your Leclerc or whatever they're called now, Spire bill, there's a line for gross receipts tax. It's different in every municipality. It's voted on by the people anytime it's instituted or raised. So bottom line is it's tax revenue for the municipality. To what purpose it goes to is up to that municipality. In St. Louis County, for instance, it's pretty interesting. In the unincorporated area of St. Louis County, the gross receipts taxes that the residents pay on their utilities goes directly to the county police department. So it doesn't go to general revenue necessarily in the unincorporated area of St. Louis County. So just an example.
Just want to make sure I'm understanding. The gross receipts tax is going to be passed on to the customer by
every tax,
right? Passed on to the customer. We're paying one way or another as a voter, right? So again, in terms of like benefit to the voter in this way, I'm just trying to contextualize it. Increased access for those who pay for the service. But it means a decrease in what the telecom companies are currently paying to the city.
I think that's accurate. I'm not a proponent of this thing. It's the first I ever read about it was this one sentence here. But I think you have I think you have boiled it down accurately.
Okay. I mean, I have to say, when I looked at the language of this, I was like, there are a lot of words to dig through to try and figure out how this affects the voter.
It was writing stuff like this that got me kicked out of journalism school.
Alejandro, were you going to say something? Speak to this.
I was just laughing because the wording is just crazy too. It's just crazy.
I want to open it up to our viewers. We've got a few minutes left, and I wanted to see if there's some questions directly from the people who are tuning in. We know how important these issues are. We hear on the news a lot about the national election, but one of the things we know is that what happens in your home, in your county, in your city is in some ways even more important than what happens on a national level in terms of affecting your daily lives. So I want to hear from folks who have questions out there in Facebook land and YouTube land and Instagram land. We've got a question here from the chat. Does the money for early childhood education actually go to St. Louis City schools or to private and nonprofit schools? Do private and nonprofit schools have access to any of the tax funding from Proposition R?
So from what I've read, the Children's Services Fund would be administered by the Mental Health Board, and it would be for children under the age of 5, and it would not go to public or charter schools.
To private or charter schools. So strictly public schools.
I'm sorry, public and charter schools. It would not go to public or charter schools.
The funding would not go to public schools?
It would not go to public or charter schools. It would go for under 5 years old. Okay. So your public and your charter schools start at age 5. So
I see.
Right.
So this funding would exclusively go to private schools that have preschool programs?
I don't know if it would go to a private school that had early childhood. It may. I'm not sure about that, but the money would not directly go to public or charter schools.
Yeah, what I know about it is that it's, like you said, managed by the Mental Health Board, which operates the city's Children's Services Fund. So not sure how deep in connection that is to private schools.
Got it. So these would likely be independent early childhood programs that are created to serve the communities, to prepare our children to be able to be ready for kindergarten when they're onboarded at 5.
Mm-hmm. That's the impression that I've gotten from proponents of this bill.
A number of I've lived in a lot of states around the country, and a number of the cities I've lived in have had these kind of independent tax-funded early childhood programs that are standalone. So I can conceptualize that. There's another question in the chat. This goes back to Proposition D, which is about this new election process. The question was, will it increase the cost for candidates running for office? Will it affect?
To the extent that right now, if you win the Democratic primary, your election is over in the state. And so now if you're in the top 2, you're going to have to run an additional election, and that's up to the voter whether that's a good thing or not. But in terms of will it increase the cost of running for office? Probably.
It doesn't explicitly increase the cost, but an effect of it may be that candidates might have to spend more money running for office, but the trade-off of that is that we have more fair elections, and we have people who are taking those seats who actually earn, the majority of the city, who earn those seats. So they might have to work a little bit harder, but that's okay with me.
Will it affect at all funding that comes in through a partisan fashion? In this, will you still have candidates who are being funded via parties in this nonpartisan election system?
Political parties have been so weakened over the last couple of decades in this country. If you look at elections generally right now, the parties are the weakest entity. It's all of these third-party groups that are out there. The Citizens United decision, which has really opened up a whole different way of running for office. And it's special interest, third parties. A lot of the money is not disclosed. That money will continue to play a role in the elections in the city, whether this thing passes or not. As far as any kind of a meaningful force, the Democratic and Republican parties in the city of St. Louis, they put virtually nothing into these campaigns.
I see. Is
that accurate? You guys?
Yeah.
I see the nodding of heads across the screen. There's a question that goes back to our kind of open general questions that we started the conversation with. And I'm assuming this is for the county because you can only vote at your precinct. Oh no, maybe it's not.
That's in the city.
Let me ask the question, and then instead of assuming I remember. The question is, do we need to sign up for voting at the satellite locations, or can anyone go?
In both the city and the county, both entities have satellite absentee voting locations. You don't need to sign up in advance to go. It is very much akin to just going to a regular polling place. The only difference is you're technically voting absentee. You need to state a reason when you're doing it.
And in the county, you can actually go online and see how long the line is at your satellite, which is a nice little convenience as well.
I like that, a little waiting time in advance.
Yeah, you all have done a great job, Eric. Really and truly.
Yeah, they have. I mean, we're talking about taking the extra mile to call people whose ballots have been rejected for lack of a signature and things like that. I mean, changing the envelope, the return envelope, to make it easier for people to understand what they need to do. And we're talking about a simple ask. We consider this, and they do it. It's really cool. It's very phenomenal.
I hate to do this, but at my age, I drink this whole club soda. I need to step aside for a moment.
No problem.
Be right back.
We will see you in just a moment. So to that end, I mean, this has come up a couple of times where the county, Eric, has been praised for the access that it's providing and trying to create a level of convenience for county residents to be able to exercise their constitutional right. I'm wondering, again, in terms of how the county works with the city and whether the city might be adopting some of these policies, or if there are challenges to that same kind of level of radical access in the city. Are there thoughts on that?
Well, with the return envelope, the same recommendation that some of us gave St. Louis County, and they did it. St. Louis City didn't do it exactly like we'd hoped, but they did make some changes. So, for example, they put dark boxes around each section to identify what people need, to make sure that they didn't miss it. So, where the signature is, for where you check a box to testify that is your actual address. So, and then they are reaching out to people whose ballots have been rejected. They're calling them, they're sending them letters. So, they're amenable also. One thing that we didn't get a chance to do with them, what we tried to do, and they were going to, and we wanted to be able to come into their offices and help them with rejected ballots. But because of COVID and the distancing, they don't have the space like St. Louis County does.
Got it.
So
we had another question coming from the chat. It says, if we don't receive the ballot in the mail and we requested a mail-in ballot, can we still vote in person? Denise talked about surrendering your ballot, but what if you don't have a ballot to surrender?
Yeah.
So I believe if you don't have a ballot to surrender, you can fill out a lost ballot affidavit. I do know that one.
Yeah, that's what she said.
And so if you fill out the lost ballot affidavit, and then are you then filling out a provisional ballot, or you're able to vote and that's in your affidavit is connected to your traditional ballot?
Yeah, it's a regular ballot you fill out, and this is something that can really differ across all the counties in the state of Missouri. Again, Missouri gives its various counties a lot of autonomy, relatively speaking, when it comes to the administration of elections. There aren't, in some respects, there aren't a lot of standards across the state. That being said, in St. Louis County, what I always try to really hammer home to voters, no matter what, you can always go to a polling place on election day and vote. There's going to be a way. So if the ballot never came, if the dog ate your ballot or whatever, if you go to a polling place, at least in the county, we have a process. We can verify whether or not we've already received your ballot. And if we haven't, then you'll vote a regular ballot just like every other voter. It might take an extra couple minutes for us to verify that, but you're still going to be able to vote. But it is, as Denise mentioned, it is best if you have the actual ballot. If you surrender it to the poll workers, then it's just going to expedite the process a little bit.
That's great. We have another question that came up around the idea of absentee ballot. It said, if you voted absentee and then moved to another county or city, does that status follow you, or do you need to request a new absentee ballot? If you've already voted, you voted, right? You counted, and if you've moved, then your vote counts for the county you were in. You don't have to request a new ballot.
Yeah, if you've already voted, you voted. I will say, though, Missouri has a particular state law, and again, this harkens back to the days prior to a statewide voter database. If you move between counties, it's technically a new registration. So if you move from St. Louis City to St. Louis County, you have to register to vote by the voter registration deadline, which in Missouri is essentially 30 days before the election. So if you moved to a new county and you didn't re-register to vote, you're going to be out of luck, unfortunately. There is one small caveat. If you moved to a new county after the deadline for voter registration, you can vote what's called an intrastate ballot, which is a limited ballot just for statewide and federal candidates. But that's the only really exception there. So, but again, back to your question, once you voted, you voted.
Got it. I know, John, you said this is a question about Amendment 1, that really Amendment 1 comes down to how a voter feels about term limits. So from the chat, folks want to know, can you help them figure out what they feel about term limits by giving some pros or cons to term limits?
I am personally opposed to them. Most Republicans support them. It's the idea in support of term limits is that you churn people out, you get more different kind of representation, you don't get entrenched people in office, you get a lot of new blood. So people who like term limits don't like career politicians serving in these offices. I happen to believe that as a voter, I ought to be able to vote for whoever I want to vote for. If I want to send the same person back to office for 20 years, I should have that right. But that's really a principal question, and people can have very legitimate different points of view on it.
Does anyone else want to speak to pros and cons of term limits?
Yeah, I agree with what John said. And the other thing is that these 2-year term limits, by the time they get their feet wet, it's time for them to run again. And so if your mind is always on running for another term, then how well are you going to be able to do the job? So I'm not necessarily opposed to term limits. I just think that 2 years is not enough time for people to really get acclimated into the job. But I also agree that I should be able to vote whoever I want to vote for.
When I was in the legislature, 100 years ago, there were people that we didn't have term limits, and there were people that had been there. People like Wayne Good, for example, who just passed away, who were institutions, and they had institutional knowledge, and they were leaders, and you had the ability in those days that you could actually form relationships across party lines. And I believe the system of government worked better when Democrats and Republicans got to know each other a little bit, got to understand their differing life experiences, and form these relationships. It was one of the things that helped get legislation passed. And with term limits, you just simply don't have the time to form those kinds of relationships. And just look at how polarized our conversation has become in this country.
Yeah.
And it's not all because of term limits, but I think term limits play a role in that. Now, that's just my personal opinion. And there's plenty of people out there that think term limits are great. And if you do, you ought to vote for this thing.
Yeah.
We have one final question. You guys have been amazing. Let me just say, this has been so helpful, I think, for all of the folks watching. Certainly for me, I feel much more prepared to tackle these propositions on the ballot and to go ahead and do my voting. But the final question from the chat is one that speaks to kind of the mood of the people. A lot of people have expressed a general discouragement and resignation. What, if anything, makes you hopeful about this election? And this is a question I'd love for each of you to answer. What is it about this election in this moment that makes you hopeful? What can you share that might encourage folks who are feeling a bit of the malaise of 7 months of global pandemic and the national energy around politics right now? What's motivating you? Do we want to? I'll let you guys popcorn it, but I'd love for everyone to speak to this. Let's throw some hope in the conversation.
All right. Well, I've thought about this question a lot, just for myself personally, because I've spent the last 4 years or so fighting for the right to vote. And so for me, we have all of this stuff going on. We've got COVID. We have all these other things that are happening. Voting is the one thing that I still have that provides some sort of power for me or gives me voice. And so I refuse to be deflated by the negativeness that is happening in this country, because it's not fair to me. It's not for the people that are younger than I am. Mm-hmm. And so what I would say is that understand, be educated, know what the issues are, know who you're voting for, take a stand, and fight. We have to fight to keep our democracy. This is it. If we don't do this, there isn't anything else because voting affects every single aspect of your life. Mm-hmm. It affects who is in office in terms of who the police chief is, and it has an impact on the minimum wage. Voting is everything. And so I think that's the piece that people don't quite understand. I think they're hearing all the noise and not listening to or thinking about what's real, because there's so much disinformation, there's so much confusion. So I would say just be encouraged. There isn't a perfect candidate. There isn't a perfect proposition necessarily, but there definitely isn't a perfect. So you can't vote based on that person, or you have to vote based on conditions. Mm-hmm. How do you want to live? Do you want to live better? Do you want some things to change? So to me, we've got to fight. So that's my hope.
Thank you.
I can hop in. So yes, I definitely understand this general blanket of discouragement, we don't really want to be here. And I think it's very valid for people to not be excited about the tickets that we have before us. But in my opinion, SP's job to hold that and then also still push through to win the seats and issues that we have to win this year. I think something that I'm hopeful for is that we have seen how easy voting early can be, how easy absentee voting can be. So I'm hopeful that maybe this will be a nudge in the right direction. We talked about how a lot of different things with COVID-19 have changed the way that we're voting this year, but that's temporary. So hopefully this will inspire some change into permanently changing Missouri's very antiquated voting system.
I guess I would say that, the six of us up here, there's probably an issue or two that we disagree on. And if we lived in Uzbekistan tonight, there's not anything we could do about that. If we lived in Hong Kong with what's going on, there would be nothing that we could do about that. And the one thing that the six of us all have in common here is that we have all chosen to engage in this system of government. Broken though it is, flawed though it is, with a torturous history though it has, we've all engaged in that system, and we've all done it effectively. And we've all, in our small way, have made a difference. And I choose tonight to celebrate the fact that this is a nation that allows people like us, wherever we came from, whatever we were, my parents didn't graduate from high school. But this is a nation where any of us, all of us, can get engaged. And I hope that once we've made a decision as a people, locally, in the state, and in the nation, that we can all come together and make this a more perfect union, because that was the ultimate objective of our Constitution, was to create a more, not a perfect union, that doesn't exist, a more perfect union. And I am an optimist by nature, so I'm hopeful that once we get over the hill over the next 9 days or however long it is, we'll be able to do that.
Thank you.
I feel like to me, it's important to remember that change sometimes doesn't happen from one day to another. Change happens with time, with effort, with us participating. For example, women's right to vote, indigenous right to vote, didn't happen from one day to another. So it's important to keep us, to remind ourselves that whatever change we want to see in our society, in our future, we need to keep fighting, and we need to keep participating in the democracy that is the United States of America. So just keep in mind the future that you want to see, the future that you want to give to your family, and just believe that the power that you have in yourself, that you have a power because you can vote, and voting will change, maybe sometimes later, but will change for a future that you want to see. So don't be discouraged, and if everything that you feel like that you feel wrong, take those feelings and put it into action, and go to the polls and participate.
Thank you. Eric?
Well, I don't know how I ended up last on this. I'm probably the least eloquent person on this panel, but I would say I was pessimistic leading into this election for this reason. And my reasons are at a very micro level here. And that is, leading into this election, every voter, not every voter, but quite often I would speak to voters that were very quick to be aggravated and angry that any little thing that happened, it's voter suppression, or it's fraud, or something like that. And there's this old saying, never attribute to malice what can be explained by incompetence. And so just because your voter registration application fell behind somebody's desk, it's not fraud or disenfranchisement, it's a mistake. That being said, we work very hard to correct mistakes when they happen. And the voters who have been coming in to vote absentee in person, and I check in voters every day in person, and I have been heartened by all the positive comments we've gotten from voters, and by the positive attitude of the voters, that they are energized to stand in line. They're energized to vote. they're asking more questions than ever about the process, about, okay, what happens to my ballot now? What do you do with my signature? All this and that. So yeah, it's funny. I have actually been to Uzbekistan, and I have observed a presidential election in Uzbekistan. And John is right that things are a lot different here. That yes, the voting laws and the voting procedures are not always maybe how we all would like to see them, but it's also not Uzbekistan. So I'm cautiously optimistic leading into this election, and I think if voters can just maybe on election night tune out the media, that I can tell you left, right, or anything in the middle, the media, they freak out on election night if there are not results like right away. Every election authority in this country and in this state, they're going to get all the ballots counted, and they're all going to be counted accurately. Well, I'm going to speak only for myself in that regard in St. Louis County. But if you have patience, the process is going to work. And that's all I can tell people, because cable news needs to fill up time on election night. And just wait. The results are going to come. They'll be there.
I want to say thank you to all of you, and to Denise, who had to leave us earlier. This has been so valuable to our community. Your expertise, your insight is really helpful as we go to the polls. And I also appreciate you guys filling us with the reminders of what it is that we are working for and towards. I will say that I come from a long line of activists who believe fundamentally in everyone exercising their constitutional rights. So many people across gender, race, ethnicity have fought to have equitable footing in this country. And I would encourage everyone watching that voting, I don't care how you vote your values, but get out and vote. And we're going to flash one more time if we can. And this will be available for you to run back so that you can see the resources that have been shared by our illustrious panelists to help support everyone's ability to get out the vote. Finding out information about judges, remembering again, there's no reason for you to walk away from the polls without voting. If you run into issues, call the hotline, 800-OUR-VOTE. Get the help and resources that you can. If nothing else, make sure you fill out that provisional ballot. Don't walk away without letting your voice be heard. Thank you, panelists, for your time, your resources, your ingenuity, and your passion for our electoral process. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so